me about that.
That's better. All right, guys. This is Thoughtful Banter. I'm your host, Matthew, with my co-host, Hussein.
Yes, sir.
And today, we are going over a video that Hussein actually shared with me randomly when I was at work. He sent me this link. He's like, yo, what are your thoughts, bro? And it was Mike Israetel on Dr. Mike's podcast. It was a great episode. And, you know, I listened to it, and then Hussein and I since then have had like probably 2 to 3 hours worth of conversation about the podcast episode. So much so that we just decided, hey, let's just record an episode on our podcast talking about it, because we think it had some great discussion points. Hussein has some parts of the conversation that he wants to highlight. I have some parts of the conversation that I wanted to focus on. So we're just going to go back and forth discussing our observations, getting each other's perspectives, and just dissecting the episode. But before we begin, we just want to say thank you guys so much for watching this. And if Dr. Mike or Dr. Mike Israetel come across this isn't a like hit piece or anything. I'm fans of both of them. I think Hussein is too. We just really like the show.
Honestly, I remember Dr. Mike, like the doctor, like the MD, like from around this, like when he started his channel. I remember him and that dude, Legal Eagle. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I like him.
I don't know if they actually started around the same time, but I remember them like coming into contact with him around the same time. I never really watched Dr. Mike, but I never really had anything against him, and I always thought he was like a pretty decent like interviewer, and I think he did a phenomenal job in this interview specifically. And then Dr. Mike, I'm less familiar with. I knew of him mainly through Mahdi, and also like back in the day, I don't know if you remember, but when we were watching like the bodybuilding, because me and Mahdi and I grew up on like bodybuilder YouTube. Right? We grew up on like bodybuilder YouTube in like early 2010s, right? So if anyone who's watching this, they remember Chris Jones, they remember Rich Piana, they remember Cali Muscle, like when he was like juiced out of his mind, right?
Yeah. He's lost weight since then. Now he's like vegan and juicing, and he's changed the color of his eyes. He's doing crazy stuff.
But there's also Vegan Games, who came around a little bit later, but he was like critiquing these guys, Kino Buddy, all these guys. Like way back in the day, Dr. Mike Israetel and Vegan Games had a debate about veganism. And I remember watching it back then and having no idea who Israetel was. But then later I came into contact with him through you, and I never connected the dots until I watched it.
That's such crazy lore, because I do not recollect that at all.
Yeah, bro.
Like I saw him like 2 years ago, maybe.
And that's like the first time. Like Dr. Mike, Dr. Mike Israetel is pretty into like the philosophy and stuff, like moral philosophy and all that kind of stuff. Like pretty staunch atheist, or maybe agnostic. I don't know exactly. Doesn't really believe in God, Jewish background, and he's like this exercise science, but he also like dabbles in this philosophy, and I didn't remember because this conversation between him and Dr. Mike MD gets pretty philosophical, and that actually triggered my thoughts to the conversation he had with Vegan Games way back in the day. It was interesting.
Yeah, I'm just quickly before we get into the episode, do you remember if he tore Vegan Gains apart? Because I would think he would. Like, he has a higher raw intelligence for sure, but he also is just like, he has way more actual like education.
I don't remember. A lot of these vegan, like anti-vegan, or like vegan versus non-vegan conversations end up being like, well, like for example, the one with Destiny. This is one I can think of like off the top of my head. Destiny was like, oh well, I'm not vegan because like me individually being vegan doesn't actually make a difference. It's like the similar like to the voting argument, right? Like my individual vote doesn't actually make a difference in who wins the election, so I'm just not gonna care about it and not vote. And that's basically the argument. But it just ends up being like, oh well, I care about this thing. Oh well, I care about this thing. clash, 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 and then the end is like, oh, I still care about this thing.
I see.
And so it
Yeah.
goes nowhere.
So it didn't really sound it to you. Okay. Well, when you shared the point of me, when you shared the episode with me, a couple points of mine that were really controversial, and this was talked
Tell them
about.
what it's about. What is the episode about?
So, well, for one, it's just an interview of Dr. Mike interviewing Mike Israetel. It's on Dr. Mike's podcast. But he brings up some pretty controversial subjects that
Very controversial.
Dr. Mike
Or
Israetel.
potential to get controversial, right?
Yeah, like Dr. Mike Israetel. I'm gonna call just Israetel, make it simpler. Dr. Mike is gonna be Dr. Mike, and then Mike Israetel is gonna be Israetel. I can't keep saying Mike. Basically, Dr. Mike is asking Israetel about things that he's talked about on his like a lot on his philosophy channel. Things like that are controversial are like conscientiousness and IQ, and we'll go deeper into it, but surface level, these are seemingly two of the biggest factors that are relating to someone's like morbidly obese or not, and someone's like economic status, and both factors are genetic.
In the obesity conversation, because it was about obesity like initially, and then it kind of like branched out into these like more philosophical areas. But initially, the whole thing is about like obesity, how people should go about preventing it, et cetera. And so Mike Israetel says that the two biggest factors like are we need to stop beating around the bush. Basically, the two biggest factors that determine this thing is conscientiousness and food drive, which I guess is like your want or desire to eat, and even potentially past satiation. And both these things are genetic. And then it kind of branched out in general to like, poor people in general, wealthier people in general. What is the difference between these two? And that's kind of when IQ got like a little bit. They touched on it here and there. They didn't really talk about it. That's kind of when IQ came into the picture.
It's basically eugenics is where it becomes controversial, and it's like there's really no way to beat around the bush. And Israetel was talking about like how, first of all, like part of the problem that we're in right now when it comes to like the scientific community is it's ran by a lot of people who are liberals. Like it's infested with like only or is predominantly left-leaning individuals, and with that come certain ideas that obviously color what they're studying, what they're focusing on, what gets taught in the general public, right? And what made the episode really interesting is that Dr. Mike clearly was feeling uncomfortable with what Israetel was saying, but he didn't stop having a productive conversation. He was working through the discomfort, but you could tell like he was feeling like that's gross.
And he probably I would go as I think he probably disagreed. And I don't think he disagreed about the reality of things that Israetel was talking about, but I think he definitely disagreed about how big of a factor they played. Because Israetel was like, these are the two, like from any kind of studies or scientific data that we can make sense of, the two biggest things that track that are going to like determine your obesity or a person's obesity is conscientiousness and food drive, which are both genetic. And he kept on bringing up those like twin studies and stuff like that, where like two twins live in separate households, right? And they both basically end up developing the eating habits of their parents, of their biological parents, separate from their adopted parents, right? So I don't think he was actually denying the reality of those studies necessarily. But I think they basically disagreed on like how much of an effect it played. So like Israetel was like, this accounts. I mean, I don't believe he said this. I don't think I remember him saying this, but it seemed like from what I was watching, he believed it was probably like upwards of 50% of the reason why people are the way they are. Whereas Mike Israetel is like, oh well, it's like multifactorial and it's kind of hard to pull some of these things apart, right? If you bring into account someone's lower education because their socioeconomic status, all these advertisement companies are like targeting them with their ads and stuff like that,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera. Like it's like this whole big math problem, as opposed to Israel. He's like, it's really 1+1, and then like 0.25 or like 0.5 for the other factors.
It's interesting, and the conversation even makes me feel uncomfortable because you can extrapolate to other areas. But before we do that, just to give the audience some context, and by the way, everyone should like listen to the episode. It'll probably make this conversation here more interesting. But let's bring it into like, let's make it about us. Like let's bring it into our lives, right? I'm by definition obese. Okay, for context, I'm 5'8", or 5'9". Depending on who you ask. I have my boys would say I'm 5'11", but I'm 5'8". I'm 260 pounds. I'm probably between 32 to 35% body fat. All right. That's big. Now, from my whole life, I actually don't remember a point where I was ever less than 200 pounds. Like, I remember being, like, this sounds crazy, but I remember, I think, being 250 pounds when I was, like, 14. And in the last 10 years or so, my weight has fluctuated between 220 and 260. And at different times, I'll be like a higher percentages of muscle mass and higher or lower percentages of body fat. But my weight has always been in that same area. Now, when I notice my behavior with food versus my wife, right? My wife, if she has a bag of like chips in front of her that tastes really good, she will like slowly and meticulously eat each chip that she wants. And she'll stop at chip number 3, and she'll be like, "That was delicious." And she'll like wrap, and I'm looking at her like, "How did you stop at 3 chips?" So like when he's talking about hunger drive, like that's just so relatable. Like even right now, I'm trying to get down to 200 pounds, right? I'm trying intermittent fasting, and I'm skipping breakfast. I'll find that when I hit my first meal, and again, I'm not even thinking about food. Like I'm not thinking about food consciously at all. But the moment I come near food and I begin consuming food, if I actually stop to see how I'm acting, it's like a savage animal. Like I'm sounds bad. I'm in a state of arousal. I'm in a high state of arousal, right? Like I'm physically like alert. I'm like I am dogging this food, right? So you see, like this is a really, really real thing. As someone who deals with like high food drive, it's a real thing. And like I think it makes people uncomfortable when we speak about that in genetics, right? Because everyone wants to think we're just only in control of our own environment, and it seems ugly to say, hey, some people are just built different, but it's true. And real quick, I'll also say the same thing about IQ. Okay, I had to get tested for ADHD because to get a diagnosis, you need to actually get like tested by a psychologist. Part of my diagnosis gave me an IQ test. My IQ test is not high. It wasn't low, but it was like straight solid average. Yeah. Okay? And I'm like, that sucks. However, when I look at the things that I'm not good at, and then I looked at my IQ rating, I'm not really surprised. So I'm just saying, like, it was uncomfortable for me to listen to. It also kind of hit home, but I also have some disagreements. But I'll pass the mic to Hussein.
Yeah, I mean, so it's Dr. Mike or Israetel makes like a big point of like, hey, I don't like talking about these things because everyone jumps to like, you're a Nazi, basically. And I think the reason why people do that is because, the Nazis, outside of their mass extermination of people, right? One of the things behind their ideology was that there is this hierarchy, right? And difference in the genetics between the races, right? And so, when you start talking about conscientiousness being genetic, food drive being genetic, IQ being genetic, and you start talking about the reality of race and there being different tiers of these things in the races, it does lead down some like potentially interesting rabbit holes for what your solution to that is, right?
Right.
Which is probably why the Nazi accusation gets brought up. Now, for Israetel, he calls himself like a secular humanist, so he's atheist or whatever, but he believes like very strongly in the value of a human life, right? And so he's like any unnecessary loss of human life is a tragedy, point blank, period. And now with the advent of like uh, AI and the progress that people are making in like the science of modifying genetics, or maybe not even like again, I don't know exactly what Ozempic. I know that Ozempic blunts your appetite, right? So it like limits your food drive. I don't know exactly the mechanism through which it's working though. Like I don't know if it's like a genetic something that it's like it's changing your epigenetics or something. Um, or if it's just like not stimulating or stimulating a part of your body. I have no idea how it works. But he's like basically as kind of these kind of more drugs in development happen, we don't need to go the eugenics route. We don't need to go the eugenics route. But eventually we'll get to such an advanced stage, whenever that is, that if someone wants to who's of low conscientiousness and high food drive, for example, and they're morbidly obese, and they want to be like, hey, I want to change my genetics so that I have low food drive and high conscientiousness, they can just stab themselves with a needle like steroids or whatever, and then become that person.
Right.
Um, so you were talking about how like the food drive kind of portion of the conversation hit home. For me, it was the conscientiousness part of the conversation. The reason why it hit home for me is because I know a lot of people personally, and I know about a lot of people personally who always seem to find themselves in trouble, right? And they always seem to find themselves in trouble in bad situations. They always seem to not be able to diligently work at something for long periods of time. Um, and they just typically have a very, very like narrow view of the world, meaning that like there's not really a lot of thought put to others. It's always like on themselves. And just so I can kind of explain conscientiousness from what I understand of it, it's basically the ability to one, think outside of yourself broader and do that second and third order thinking, which is like, okay, if I do this thing, then the consequences, I may get this gain now, right? But the consequence of that gain is this, and then this, and then potentially this, if I'm not on my stuff. Or even if I'm on my stuff, something random could happen. I could still be in bad luck. If I were to use an example, it's like, okay, I have to pay for this car repair. I have the option. I have $100 in my bank account. The car repair costs $100. If I lose my car, I can't get to work and I can't make any more money. I also have the option of putting it on this credit card with extremely high interest, say for the sake of example, 50% interest or something, right? That doesn't happen, but this is just an example. I have a credit card that I could put this, that charges me 50% interest, that I could put this car repair on. I also have other expenses that I need to pay for to get through the week, right? I need to buy food, for example. The low conscientiousness person says, let me put this on this 50%, this credit card that charges me 50% interest so that I can pay for this repair, fix my car, go to work, and then I still have money to pay for whatever else I may need during the week. And then they end up like effing themselves over because they're paying 50% interest, right? They're paying 50%, and they don't pay it off on time. And that was like a really rough, like off the top of my head example. So
A lot of examples.
comport all the way, huh?
A lot of other examples, just for the audience, right? It's like, very simply put, like, you can't hold down a job consistently. And, like, I think everyone's been fired from a job before.
Mm.
That's a common experience. But like constantly being fired from a job because of not coming on time, not fulfilling your obligations, like you're not filling in your timesheets, like you're just not doing the adulting. You have like zero attention to detail. Signs of low conscientiousness.
Yeah. There's like these strong. Um, so I think Israetel was like in the podcast. He was like changing between like this is causative versus this is correlative, right? Like there's a strong correlation here versus this is like the causal factor. I think it's important to make a distinction, but there are like a lot of strong correlations between like people of low socioeconomic status and like high socioeconomic status, for example. Like people in general who are of higher socioeconomic standard tend to be nicer, right? They tend to follow through on what they say more, right? They tend to, like there's all these kind of studies that like shows some kind of correlation between socioeconomic status and a higher level of conscientiousness. Of course, there are going to be people. There are going to be very wealthy people who are low conscientiousness, and there are going to be very poor people who are very high conscientiousness. There's no like set pattern necessarily as far as your economic status is concerned. Now, if I believe correctly, Israel believes that there is a racial reality behind these things. I don't think he talked about it in this podcast, but that's like maybe the darker side.
So yeah,
of not just
imagine
opinion,
saying
but
that
this
though,
conversation. Like when you really start like grappling with these things, and you're like, okay, if this is genetic, if that is genetic, if this is genetic, what are we actually saying?
Yeah, it was interesting, and I think it's also worth mentioning. We had a conversation, you and I, with one of our local scholars, right, who was actually talking about something somewhat similar. And he's just to wrap it up, like Islamically, or kind of an Islamic point. To my understanding, there's nothing necessarily Islamically incorrect about saying there could be differences between different races. And human is human either way, right? There's nothing wrong with like different people are just good at different things. It sounds really wrong to say like, hey, for example, this race of people tends to have a lower level of IQ, like just tends to have a lower IQ. But at the same time, IQ also isn't everything. And you can see that because every society around the world at some point has flourished. To be fair. And also different societies are good at very different things. And you can also see that. And they just have different values. So it's like, but it's just the liberal side of things is like, no, everything is equal and there's no differences. And if you point out these differences, you're a goddamn Nazi. But what's interesting is, and with what Israetel is saying, is like, well, technically, like the liberal will be mad if you say, hey, like obesity is just people's faults. It's not because of food deserts. It's not because you don't have money. Because processed food is actually more expensive than groceries. And food deserts, what the heck is even a food desert? Like you don't need extensive selections of vegetables to lose freaking weight. You just need to eat at a lower calorie amount. So if you have less food to have access to, you should be slimmer. Doesn't make any sense at all. But anyways, if you actually say that someone is fat also because of their genetics, you've also made it that it's actually not their fault. So I think it's interesting if you ask the liberal who's like, oh no, well, you're being racist. Well, it's like, well, you're actually saying it's people's fault, and I'm saying, they just have, this is just their genetics, and they actually need like medical intervention to not be obese
or something,
right?
Or
for some things,
whatever the solution is,
right? But willpower ain't working because it's like the 10th year in a row New Year's resolution. Like, I was big, bro. This won't be me next year for real. I'm like, damn. something at work if this don't work.
Um, yeah, but I mean, like, also to to Israetel's point, I think it's also like the liberal or the left leaning, because there's right liberals and left liberals, but like the left wing, let's say, individual says if a person is fat, right, or if a person is poor, then it must be for reasons outside of their control. So they both say it's like not that person's fault.
Right.
But one is like environmental factors. It's a whole nature versus nurture kind of discussion there.
Right.
And I think he made a great point when he was like, if you see a rich dude or rich person F something up, you're like, or like, put himself in a really bad situation, you're like, oh, well, F him, like, he's rich, who cares? And you see a poor person do the exact same thing. It's like, oh, but he had all these societal factors that are going against him. And he had this, and he had that, and he had this, and he had that. And it's like, no, F that guy too.
Yeah, a part of this conversation reminds me, and like, correct me here because like you're the philosopher, but from my YouTube University philosophy lessons, like Nietzsche talks about this thing that's, what is it called? Like morality of the weak. Is it called that? Or like the morality of the oppressed. And it's like this notion that like because I am in the position where I'm at a lower social economic status, and because I'm the victim, therefore I'm in the right. It's like this idea that like because I'm the underdog, I'm just right. And because that person is rich, they're wrong. But it's like, I think this is actually how a good amount of people like actually just see things. But you can see how like it's not a correct worldview, because it's like, well, the moment you become in the position that you actually want to be in, what are you? Now you're just a bad person?
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah. What are you working for?
Enough. You're just you turned.
Yeah. Oh, now you're just evil. You're debt free. You make good money. You own your house. Now you're just evil, and now you owe the world, like all the homeless people you see in society who have made bad decisions. Oh, it's your responsibility. Like people see you driving your nice, expensive vehicle, they're like, bad person. And it's like, what? I got my life together. I'm bad. What'd I do? I feel like 50. We met at MeFo. Right? Yeah. It's interesting.
Because it feels like it feels, growing up here, it feels gross to say, or at least growing up in the time that we did. It was probably different back in the day. I have no idea. I wasn't there. But it feels gross to say, hey, that person who's panhandling on the side of the street is panhandling because everything, that led them to this situation is they're taking all the responsibility for that. Right? Like, they're here because of themselves. Like, it does feel gross to say that. And it probably is an oversimplification of what's actually happening.
Right.
But the others, like, the way we've corrected for this is to say, oh, well, nothing's actually their fault. It's all because of this kind of, like, social, environmental thing that's going on in the background.
It's like too many freaking excuses. Like, bro, relax. It's gone too far, bro. People are like, but he mugged somebody, he killed him, but his neighborhood, that's like, dog, like this person murdered somebody for money. Stop with the excuses. Like, I don't care.
Going back to the consciousness thing, in our conversation, one of the examples I gave you was like, people do create and build affordable housing a lot of the time because there's great tax incentives. The government pays for a lot of stuff.
You about to get mad controversial here, Hussein. Let's hear it. Let's hear it.
Government pays for a lot of stuff, right? So if you do like low-income housing tax credit, right, new development for apartments, and you accept like vouchers, like Section 8 vouchers and stuff like that for people to pay your rent, which is basically the government guaranteeing you get a rental. Like guaranteeing you get a rent payment every month, or at least a portion of a rent payment every month. there will be people who get there will be people, one, who are on this government form of government assistance, which is not a bad thing. That's probably a good thing in a thriving society, right? They're on this form of government assistance. The government assistance will pay 95% of their rent, right? Say they're on the hook for 5%, and they will consistently not pay it. You have low income housing tax credit developments are known for having humongous what they call capital expenditures, because the tenants that occupy this space that are, most of the time are getting their home for free or almost for free, treat it like garbage. And so every time a tenant moves out, you literally have to remodel the whole thing to make it rentable to the next person that comes in, for them to do the very same thing, right?
Yeah.
And that sounds like even me saying that right now, like that sounds super cancelable.
Yeah, it's like, so what are you saying? Are you saying poor people are, you know, I don't even know.
But there
like,
seems to be like some kind of pattern of a lack of something, right? Like, why is it that you're carrying this apartment that you're getting basically for free, that you don't have to pay for, to shreds?
yeah.
It's not even like regular wear and tear, bro. It's like dumps. Like they will like destroy it.
Yeah. There is also like, you know, it's when you don't have something, when something isn't your responsibility, or you don't feel like you're paying for something, you definitely don't care for it a certain way. Like, I just moved out,
Or
and my conscientiousness at my place is way higher right now than my parents' house was, which isn't right, you know. But like, I lived there my whole life. My mom's like, "Hey, do this way." I'm like, "Yeah, sure," but like, I'll mess something up, you know. Like, I won't be the tidiest. And now I'm like way more conscientious because I'm paying rent here. You know what I'm saying? So like, I think that's probably a point that's like you would have to somehow add to the equation. But it's also like what's even more controversial Dr. Michael's talking about is like conscientiousness and IQ are both genetic traits. And despite people's actions, they don't really seem to be things anyone can control. And that's where it's like, whoa, hey now. Like, hey, I mean, just imagine telling someone, hey, guess what? You're a slob. You have low conscientiousness. You can't get anything done. And guess what? You're going to stay like this forever because your genetics suck. Like, but it's like, I don't know how much I believe in.
I mean, I
I don't know how much I
haven't
believe
I
in
haven't
that.
looked at the data, right? Like that he's saying, like most of this, for all I know, right, the data could be really shoddy. I don't think that's the case, because like generally Dr. Mike has shown to me that he's a pretty well researched guy, or Israetel has shown to me that he's a pretty well researched guy. But I haven't looked into any of it myself. It could be that all of this data is completely shoddy. I will say that I think that it makes sense to me. This is complete vibes. Just for the audiences, for the record of the audience, this is complete vibes. This is I've looked into none of this. Um, but I would think that there's at least a little portion. There's at least a portion of these things, these traits, that can be affected by like sheer will, if that makes sense. Again, purely vibes for the audience's record. But I was thinking for myself, for my own experience, right? In moments where I felt like maybe my conscientiousness was lower than it should be, right? Right? Um, or it's like, one of those days you wake up and you're like, hey, I know I need to do this thing. I know I need to do it. I really don't want to do it. Like everything in my body is telling me not to do it. And you still do it anyways.
Yeah.
There are days I do not want to pick up the phone and talk to anyone, especially some random I don't know on a cold call, right?
Right.
Like,
Right.
right. Um, but you just do it because you have to do it. So I'm wondering, like, and maybe that's just, maybe he'd say that's like completely something else that's happening. I have no idea.
He might
But like,
just
I'm
say it's so
wondering to what
genetic.
effect, like, what is the
I think he probably would say it's still genetic because there's people in the same
Yeah,
position as
the
you.
fact that you go through it and do it
That's part of
anyways.
conscientiousness. I would
Mm-hmm.
disagree with him if he said that, and that's not based on any research. That's he could probably say that's based on my low conscientiousness or my low IQ, but whatever it is, I have anime monkey brain where
Mm-hmm.
and maybe it probably does come from like watching Dragon Ball Z at a young age or watching Naruto. Like the core shonen trope is willpower can overcome any circumstances, including genetic, right? But it's like I do think there is like a unstoppable power within the human spirit, and people can find a way to get something done if they desire it. Um, and I just think it's a belief thing, but I also think you gotta have beliefs like that, even if they go against science, which is crazy to say out loud. Because at the end of the day, this is something I was telling you about. Was like, there's always new research,
Mm-hmm.
and there's always new studies, and they're always improving science. So even if they tell me like, oh, dude, no, we know this is genetic. I'm like, all right. I also have to have my own beliefs because like I think it's important because the science can change tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, science is like an inductive art almost, right? Like until superconductors came around, we thought that they were physically impossible. Like there were laws of physics restrict. Like there was some kind of like you know law creator. Of course, we believe that there is one, but like some of these guys didn't. But there was some kind of law creator in the universe, and these things just couldn't happen. And then they happened, and we're like, oh, okay, well, we were wrong.
Right. Right. And like,
So yeah, I mean, in that sense, you're right. And to in Israel's defense, he doesn't believe in any of that. So like, he's staying pretty logically consistent
right.
himself, right? And I don't even think he believes in free will like at all, right?
Yeah.
Which explains kind of his bent on these things, and kind of contextualizes it a lot more. There are a lot of people like I believe maybe Sam Harris. I'm not sure. I don't think he believes in free will either. They're like, yeah, every single thing from like the molecules to the atoms that make up your being have written on them basically a code that you're going to follow, right? Essentially, that's what it is. I don't
That's
know.
such an interesting thing for an atheist to think, isn't it?
I don't know how they reconcile that with pretty much anything else they believe. Um, I'm just being honest.
Yeah.
But like, we believe that people do have free will. I think we believe that people have a far more limited free will than they actually believe, right? Everyone quotes that hadith from Imam Sadiq where he's like, lift up your leg, lift up your other leg, and he's like, you can lift up one leg, you can't lift up the other leg, and then what is commonly understood from that one, or at least how I learned it, was like, oh, Imam Sadiq is saying when he says free will is like al-amr bain al-amrain, which is like the command between two commands, or the affair between two affairs. People think that means like split down the middle, right? Like a clean 50-50. Like you have 50% determined, like 50% of it is jabr and 50% of it is qadr. Jabr is like complete like restriction, like you basically have no free will, and then qadr is like complete unrestricted free will, right? So people think that like al-amr bain al-amrain is smack in the middle, 50% jabr, 50% qadr. I actually think it's probably more like this is the here we go. This is the scale, and then say this is pure free will. This is complete non-free will. It's probably like there. It just means it's between those two. It doesn't mean it's like right in the middle of those two, right? But
see.
even with all that said, we still believe that there are aspects of free will in our decisions.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. Like David Goggins, and I swear this is relevant, right? If you're a David Goggins fan like me, his entire thing is pretty much he completely believes he basically has 100% free will. Like he's activated free will. And they've literally conducted, like he's been part of research studies from like universities, and he was part of a study of free will. And he was like on a panel, and like some scientist or professor who was leading the study was saying, like on the panel, like these are like we found this thing in people's brains, and it's completely genetic, and people with this genetic factor or whatever it is have this level of free will. And David Goggins is on the panel like, you're wrong. Like, I don't care what you said. I wasn't this person. And then at like 25 or 27, I became this person. And it's like, and despite how like, stupid and unintellectual that is, but how do you account for like this person's experience, right? Like you go from a morbidly obese, and no disrespect, just like how David Goggins referred to himself in the past, like retarded, like morbidly obese, retarded person, as in like he was largely basically illiterate in high school, learning disabilities, like slow, bad reader, bad problem solver. And then over like the span of 5 years, well, quickly loses weight, but like in the span of like 5 years or so, he goes from like some overweight guy who was killing cockroaches, getting paid like $12,000 or something a year, to being in military special forces, which isn't like, and like it's funny bringing in race into this, but it's like special forces is hard enough to get into. Statistically, there's a very small amount of black people in special forces, especially like to be a Navy SEAL. And again, it's interesting race is being brought up again. Like he literally says there's negative buoyancy, which is crazy for him to say. He's like, I don't care what you call me racist, I don't care, I'm negative buoyant, I do not flow. He's like, I don't flow, I have to do work to flow. It's like you can make any kind of jokes about it, but I've done like he's done the like. Why would he say he's negative buoyant? It's like, but I'm just saying, like, how are you going to account for this? And like, if it was genetics, why did it kick in at like 27?
I can't answer the question. One, I'm not a geneticist.
Yeah.
And two, I don't know if there's like, is there a thing about like DNA unlocking later? I have no idea.
I've heard that, right? I don't know the science. I mean, I've heard before, like, we have dormant genes that just aren't activated, and sometimes genes activate later. I mean, I'm pretty sure an example of that might be hair loss, right? You have hair, and then you just lose hair. I mean, that literally happened to me, so I don't know, but maybe you get like an IQ bump, but like, I haven't heard of people having IQ bumps or conscientiousness bumps. Like he went from zero conscientiousness to max conscientiousness. So like we're talking about IQ, right? I agree IQ is important. But you asked me about IQ, right? Like I said earlier, I have an IQ of like average. I think my IQ is like right at 100, which I would actually consider on the lower end of average, because I think average is between 90 to 120. Or 110. But let's say I have a low IQ. Okay. The results I have in my life at 25, if you look at like the statistics of like wealth and relationships and like career success, to like the average American 25-year-old, is insane. And I'm not trying to be arrogant. Like I'm not anywhere close to where I want to be. But I'm just saying, like look at the average 25-year-old in America. I'm like, so what is it? Is my IQ 150 secretly? Like, no. So I'm like, I think, in my personal theory, I think IQ only matters if it's at the very lowest point or the very highest point.
Yeah.
Because I know people personally who I would anecdotally say this person probably had an IQ of like maybe 120, 130, and I'm doing better than them. And like when we were kids, this person was like really smart, had high conscientiousness, and then it just fell off. It's like, what explained that? Like more social, like more reasons of like their actual relationships with people, that kind of thing, or just also decisions. Because I also remember distinctly being like young and hating certain things about myself, and I was like, oh no, I'm going to navigate. Like, so I think desire is important. I know. I guess technically desire is part of conscientiousness, I guess. But I also think you can be a stupid person and have strong desire as well.
Yeah, honestly, I don't know the answer to the question, and I don't even know at this point like what Israetel himself would say about this kind of thing. But I appreciate it, even like the opportunity to think about these kind of things, because it does open the door for interesting discussion.
Yeah.
Right, it's fun, and I think at the end of the day, like us as Muslims, kind of again to give that like Islamic cap. I was talking to a scholar that we know, and he was like, the reality is like, yeah, there might be differences between us. They might be real. They might even be racial, right? They might even be hierarchical in a racial sense. What we say is it doesn't matter, right? What matters is, our practice, what we do in our path towards God and our striving towards God, and how we deal with the people and the other fellow Muslims around us, right? Say there is someone who is limited in his genetics and needs to be institutionalized, for example.
Mm.
God is the ultimate judge, right? And he knows the capacities that he's put in every single person. And so when he judges that person, all our responsibility is to do right by that person. If doing right by that person includes institutionalizing him, that's what we do, right? And then however he's judged for what he did to get institutionalized, that's between him and God.
Right.
Right? So it really doesn't even like the genetic reality of these things doesn't even really matter much.
Yeah.
Right? It's what do we actually see as outcome, right? And then we go based on our obligation towards those outcomes.
Yeah. And also it's like with these IQ tests, as far as, when I took my IQ test, for example, like there's plenty of things that I thought were not accounted for. Like, and part of IQ testing, like this element is there. Like they give you like, I forget what the categorization of intelligence is called, but like they'll have you, it's like physical intelligence in the sense of like, they'll have you solve a physical puzzle. That's like a 3D puzzle. And you have to make the pieces fit. So you have to understand like abstractly, like you have to see the space in your mind and make it work with your hands. And it was difficult, right? But like, we need people who have different sets of skills. And like, I think if you took someone and gave them an IQ test and they scored really well on it, really the kind of person that would come out of that would just be someone who's like really good at like mathematics, really good at philosophy, maybe like a really good software engineer potentially, right? Like these are people who can like solve a lot of abstract problems. But there's also people like, not to be the most cliche, but like you need people who are really good at construction. We need people who are really good with their hands. Like we need people who are really emotionally intelligent. I can't put together an IKEA desk, is what I'm saying. And like we need people who can build stuff. And like everyone has different skills, and everyone should have like I think everyone has a potential for their spot in a society. And I know this is maybe a little bit off topic. I know we have to wrap up, but I think part of one potential problem I think we're running into this society is we have over prioritized a certain skill set where people are getting rewarded for it economically, but there's a lot of people who don't really fit in that frame, and they're not being rewarded for it, at least socially. Like we now have there's actually a big demand for a lot of good blue collar work, but we de-incentivize an entire generation of men from becoming plumbers, from becoming electricians, from being construction workers, and they say, oh, that's what dumb people do, go to college. And these guys are in college feeling unfulfilled, being bad at the schoolwork, but they would be 10 times happier being physically active for 12 hours a day because it's what they have a higher affinity like just towards that kind of work, but they don't even want to go close to it because everyone's made them feel stupid for going for that kind of thing. That's it.
Yeah, it's funny. Like with the AI, the advent of AI has kind of worked opposite of how we're always see it in movies and how people theorize about it. Right? It was like, oh, all the like labor jobs, like easy blue collar, not easy in the sense that it's easy, but you don't have
all
to be
the stupid, all the
like,
simple,
right?
Yeah,
simple. Is going to go first, and now we're seeing like the Excel monkey is the one that's getting phased out rather than like the white collar Excel monkey is the one who's getting phased out.
right.
It's interesting how this works. But yeah, no, I agree. Again, I think it's an interesting discussion. Ultimately, I don't think there's really too much of a right answer, and really, it's like we don't know. And to your point about like having your beliefs versus science, I think science is good. Science can also at times take itself too seriously, or like the practitioners of science, maybe I should say, take themselves too seriously and their findings too seriously. And it's not always as instructive as perhaps we think it is. Of course, there's probably a fine line to draw there, and I'm not like, that's just like a general statement. I'm not trying to say that science is not important and like we shouldn't look at studies and stuff, but you know what I'm trying to, like,
right.
You get the gist of what I'm trying to say.
Right. Yeah, and like, and just as a quick example, I know we gotta wrap up, but it's like, and there's probably more examples of science helping humanity. Again, we're not anti-science, but like, if we were just to take science at face value, like look at the food pyramid. How long ago were we saying that you should have like most of your food, most of your calories come from grains? That was science. To be fair, so it's like we need science, but like we also need to balance it with our gut instincts at times because those have something to say as well. I know we have to wrap up. This has been a great episode.
Yeah, I think Israel would probably disagree with a vast chunk of this conversation, especially when you start getting to like the more meta religious kind of ideas.
I would love to have Israetel on with his big juicy forms, just big juicy forms, just hanging out, and like that big old forehead vein. His boss is like, so everything you said was categorically incorrect, and I can express it in 3 dimensions. Number 1, you are both Muslim, and number 2, this is a biracial podcast and it shows. I'm not playing. Just, I would love that.
No, I think it's really good, really good. I'd love to have him on too. I mean, if he'd come on, that would be great. Just so we can even know more about specifically like what he's talking about, right? The details of what he's talking about. And there's probably going to be a lot we disagree on, but like, who cares? That's part of the fun of it too, right?
Yeah.
But anyways, this has been Thoughtful Banter. Hope you guys enjoyed that little bit of like a random episode, but we're reacting to this podcast that came out about 2 months ago, and I think it was like really good material, and I'd encourage everyone to go watch it, especially if you're into health and you're into trying to either lose weight or in general just gain muscle. I think Israetel is like a great follow in that regard.
100%.
But this has been Thoughtful Banter. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Peace.